for those of us where those relationships were complicated, it can lead us to feel quite lonely, quite isolated, quite on our own. Like we can't speak our truth of those parts of us and our grief that need to be expressed in order for us to process this loss.
Hey, I'm Tanya Wilkinson, and this is Death on the Daily.
We often talk about grief as love. As the saying goes, grief is love with nowhere to go. But what if you're grieving someone with whom actually there wasn't a lot of love in your relationship? What if things were difficult? What if things were distant? What if there was harm in your relationship? Human relationships can be really, really complicated, and they can be incredibly tender. And so on today's episode of Death on the Daily, we're unpacking this topic that doesn't get talked about enough in the grief space. What if we're grieving someone with whom that relationship was incredibly difficult? And in today's episode, I'm sharing the gentle invitation for you to meet yourself exactly where you are in your grief, acknowledging any complexities and any difficult parts of your relationship with that person, of that person themselves and who they were, as well as I'll be sharing a few compassionate tips to help you by way of how you can navigate your forwards path if you are in this space, if you're grieving and things feel really quite complicated to unpack, given the nature of your relationship with them. And in Death on the Daily, it's all about talking about all of the ways that death and grief shows up for us on the daily. Because I know that grief comes with a whole mixed bag of emotions, of feelings, of experience, of everything else that it brings up. And for me personally, it feels really important to be having this conversation because I talk a lot about grief as love, because I talk a lot about my daughter and my beacon of love that my grief for her is. I also talk about my grandparents. I have a lot of love for my grandparents, my 3 grandparents who've died in the past 3 years. But actually, I want to just acknowledge in this space that my relationship with my Amama, my Sri Lankan grandmother, was distant. Actually, there's a distance that was created between us, and I'm working on it in therapy to really listen to my inner child and to understand what exactly happened there. Why did I push her away? But there was a distance there. And actually, it's something that in me really grieving her since she died just this last September, I've also had to really sit with some quite difficult feelings of guilt, of beating myself up about what I could have done in that relationship to have made it better. And also grieving the fact that there was a lot of our relationship where I don't have that same warmth that I do for my grandparents. And there's a lot that I've blocked out and pushed away. So I want to start this episode just with that acknowledgement of my personal story, but also with the invitation that whatever feels difficult and painful in your relationships, to meet yourself exactly where you are today. Because for us as humans, our relationships are often not simple. They are complicated. And actually, I think that in grief, there can be this, I suppose what you call like a good grief story, the shoulds, that we should be only thinking of positive memories of them. We should put them up on a pedestal. You can't, that saying, you can't speak ill of the dead. But actually what that does is those shoulds mean that for those of us where those relationships were complicated, it can lead us to feel quite lonely, quite isolated, quite on our own. Like we can't speak our truth of those parts of us and our grief that need to be expressed in order for us to process this loss. Because in many relationships, it isn't just love and warmth and safety and heaps of joyful memories. There can be harm and significant harm. There can be distance. There can be disappointment. There can be longing for what we wish could have been. So I want us in this space and in Death on the Daily in general to drop all of those shoulds. There is no should in our grief. If you're feeling angry, if you're feeling the rage, if you're feeling really guilty about something, much like I feel with my Amama when I look back on our relationship, that's okay. That is valid and that is justified. Grief is a real mixed bag of both emotions, but also of all of those losses that we feel. And within those losses, there can be those unmet needs or those boundaries that were crossed, and perhaps we felt like we weren't able to speak our truth at the time. In those secondary losses, we can also feel it for the unspoken words, that which we wish we'd have been able to say in this lifetime, or feeling the emotions for apologies that we wish had have come our way, or apologies that we wish we'd have spoken, as well as feeling that loss of those versions of those relationships or that imagined future that you wish you'd have had. All of these can hurt so deeply, and it can be even more complicated when that relationship was complicated, because what those shoulds in our grief can lead us to do is to push these away, to no, I can't be feeling this, they've gone now. But actually these mixed emotions and acknowledging those parts of us that might be furious at that person, that might be hurt and upset at that person, that might feel that distance from that person. Actually, these are all things that we shouldn't be feeling guilty for, that we shouldn't be denying in ourselves, because grief is a completely mixed bag. So, and I'm going to keep saying this probably through this episode, give yourself that permission to feel exactly what you're feeling. And I want to make a point that feels so, so important in this space, that actually we're allowed to grieve them without having to rewrite any history, knowing that we can hold truth of our experience alongside our grief. And perhaps if there is love, and if there is the positive memories and those sides, we can hold them alongside the pain. But also if there are no positive memories, knowing that we are allowed to grieve that person exactly per our lived experience with them. So if you're feeling this grief for someone where the relationship was very complicated or difficult or painful, I wanted to share just a few little practical but gentle and soft ways that you can just support yourself in this forwards path with your grief. Not looking to fix your grief, but just to meet yourself exactly where you are in this moment. Saying this with the trauma-informed caveat that I'm a coach, I'm not a therapist. And actually, I know from my own journey where I have really lent into therapy, and it's been so powerful and so important for me to process the past. I know there's real power in reaching out for that professional support of a therapist or a counselor when it comes to processing difficult and complicated relationships, and obviously specifically where there was trauma in those relationships. So now let's dive into these practical and gentle ways that you can support yourself in your forwards path. First up, we've got allowing and naming any complexity. So this is just about meeting yourself in the present moment. And as I shared, if you want to dive into past relationships and really unpick that, then that's definitely something for a therapy or a counseling space. But actually, when we meet ourselves in the present and when we look to that forwards path, there can be real power in just allowing ourselves to meet ourselves with this mixed bag that grief can bring us. That on any day can have us feeling angry and sad and maybe some other emotions that are flowing in. And there's a simple practice that we can do to just allow this complexity of our grief. And that is just naming the different parts of us. Because actually, when we start to see there are different parts of us, we can see that my anger that I feel in grief today is not all of me. It's one part of me. But I might also be able to connect into that actually there is some meaning, there's some joy. Maybe there's not, and that is totally okay. But maybe also there's some safety that I feel inside of me. There's some calm. So you can grab your journal, or you can just speak this out loud, just naming any parts of you that you can feel in your grief. Part of me today feels sad. Part of me today feels numb and disconnected. Part of me today feels a little bit furious. Write them down, speak them out loud, speak them to someone else. If you have someone in your life, I do this with my husband all the time, where actually you can be real with and actually know that as you're speaking it, that all of these parts are valid. There can be many things that can be true at once in our experience. Second up, we've got permission to speak your truth. It's so helpful to be able to just be real with someone as we're processing our grief. So who in your support network can you reach out to where you can just be real, where you can say, actually, do you know what? I'm going to tell you that my relationship with my dad was really complicated. And actually, these are the parts where things felt really difficult, or where there was distance, or where there was hurt, where there was upset. And also, as I just shared, obviously therapy, counseling can be really, really powerful within this. As well as in my work as a grief coach, we look very much on meeting you where you are right now in your grief. We're not going to process and dive into the depths of those relationships of the past, but actually what it's about is meet you in the now. What's present right now? How can we witness that with no judgment, only love? And not rushing you into any meaning making or anything before you're ready. So find those spaces where you can speak your truth and know that it is totally valid and justified. Next up, we've got writing that letter that you're never going to send. And this is one that can also support you if you're looking around and going, I have no one in my life who I can speak to about this right now. Write that letter out. You might like to write it to the person who you're grieving. Just pour your heart out. Speak your truth. Say everything that felt like it was complicated or where you wish that there had been that apology, or write out that apology that you wish that you could speak to that person. I've done this for my mama. I've written a letter after she died and spoken to her as well a lot to say, I wish things could have been different. To say that actually I acknowledge my part in the distance of our relationship. And that, yes, there was something in my childhood that meant I pushed you away. But actually, as I became an adult and as I did the work to be present with myself in these difficult parts, that I wish that I could have reconnected and reestablished that relationship. And know that you can rip this letter up afterwards, or you can chuck it away. You don't have to keep this letter, and it could be a really cathartic process. Next up, we've got just noticing what your body is holding. And from this space, seeing what gentle care or perhaps a little bit of movement, a little bit of shaking can release. Because grief doesn't always show up in our tears and in our sadness. It can be internalized into our body. It can be our tight shoulders. It can be that clenched of our jaw. And actually, when we tune into our body and we see, oh, my stomach feels in a knot today, we can also ask ourselves, what do I need right now to support me in my grief? Is there some gentle movement? Is there a walk in nature? Is there some rest that we need? And finally, we've got taking the pressure off of ourselves to find that forgiveness or that closure. This feels like a really important one because I know that for us as humans and in our culture and society where we want to sort of tie everything up with a neat bow and get to completion. And actually in the grief space, there's a lot of chat about healing in grief. And I don't believe that we are ever healed. I know that grief is a wound, a beautiful wound that I feel for my daughter. It's a beacon for of my love for her. But I know that that wound won't ever be fully healed, and that is okay. But actually, when the relationship was really difficult, when it was complicated, that can make it even more painful for us to say to ourselves, you know what, this might be unresolved. There might be some unanswered questions. But I really believe that just as death and grief for me have really taught me that actually there's only so much in this life that we can answer and that we can control. I really believe that actually in grief, it's about being able to find a new way of learning to live with our grief and perhaps those aspects of our grief that is rooted in those what ifs, those unanswered questions, those parts that feel complicated. And I'm not here to say that it's going to be an easy journey to get there. What I am here to say is that actually it's just about taking it step by step, breath by breath on this journey, giving yourself lots of grace, lots of compassion, but also connecting into others to allow yourself to speak your truth. And that's also where actually finding grief support groups and spaces where you can speak your truth and you might just connect in with someone who says, oh my goodness, I feel exactly the same way. There can be real power in us sharing our experiences. It's why I do what I do. So permission to take that pressure off. There is no perfect way to grieve. In fact, perfection doesn't exist in this life in general. There's no perfect relationships. Even if you're looking around at other people's relationships where their grief seems to be all rooted in love and that's it, guaranteed there is going to be complexities in many spaces within that relationship. And remember that there is no right or wrong way to grieve. Just meet yourself exactly where you are. And on any day, again, just connect into your body and see what grace, what compassion, what kindness, and what care do I need to give to myself? So that completes this episode of Death on the Daily. And if you're watching this and navigating that tender forwards path with grief that feels really quite complicated as well in the nature of it, I just want to put my hand on my heart to say that I am right here, right alongside you in griefy solidarity. Take it step by step, breath by breath. Reach out to other people for support. Find those spaces where you can really speak your truth, those people who it's safe to do so with, as well as obviously where the relationships were complicated and there's a lot of stuff that we also need to dive into in our grief, but also in the past. Just seeking out any of that professional support that can hold you and help you to process through it. So wherever you are in your journey, know that I'm always here. Death on the Daily is always here. I'm sending you lots of love. And if this episode resonated with you, then maybe just hit that subscribe button. And that means you will never miss an episode of this podcast, as well as helping me to get the message out there and to reach more grievers. But above all, just go forwards with all of that gentle grace and tenderness. And I'm sending lots of love. Thank you for joining me on Death on the Daily. If you like this episode, it would mean a lot if you could hit subscribe. Plus, head to the show notes to find out about my work as a grief coach, and there's a grief journaling freebie there for you. Until we meet here next time, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something